why did economists fail to predict the crisis? I think there's actually a fairly simple answer to that. And that is, in order to predict the crisis, we needed to join several different subfields of economics. And the rules as to what you can and cannot write in economics makes it very difficult to do that. So in fact, I think if you go back and look, after the crisis, we could go back and look, and the economists in finance had just done incredible work, which then, if you applied it, it really did predict that there would be a crisis. But for some reason or other, that was not supposed to be something that you were supposed to do. And so a lot of them knew it, but knowing it, it would have been out of place for them to have actually said, this is going to produce a crisis. So that's one reason. That's the reason that the theorists didn't predict a crisis. But then there's a second reason why they didn't predict crisis, and that is what economics is supposed to be about. Is it supposed to be about science? We're supposed to do science. And what is science supposed to be? The way economists interpret science is you're supposed to do statistics. Now, statistics are about what happens when you have a population. But the thing is, if you want to predict a crisis, where the crisis was going to come from wasn't from a population, it was from the tail end of the population. So think about it. So go back to the year 1998. There was long-term capital management. Well, what happened with long-term capital management? A group of people, it could just be you and me, if we were a little bit richer maybe, or a little bit more famous, that what they did was they managed to put together a very small number of people. They put together a hedge fund which managed to generate $1 trillion of face value worth of indebtedness. Now, that was an outlier, and what there was threatened, the failure of long-term capital management was threatened to bring down the whole financial system. So the fact is, that's not a statistic. That, in order to predict the crisis, what you had to do is you had to look at the very fact that people could do such things, and that was a possibility. So the problem was economists tend not to be in that business. So in fact, we have to redefine. So it's not that economists don't do good things. We do many, many, many good things. And I think economics, to a great extent, modern economics is on exactly the right track. But there's some things which are what I call sins of omission. Those sins of omission are areas where, in fact, our methodology keeps us from doing things like predicting the financial crisis. So that's, I feel that's why it wasn't predicted, and it was automatic. It automatically resulted as an equilibrium from how economists think economics should be done. In every situation, people have a view as to who they are. What person are you going to be? What person are other people going to be? And then you relate how you relate to them and how they relate to you is all a matter of who the people think they are and who people think they are within a given situation. And so that, you see, that in fact brought the whole concept of how we do economics into a new realm. So it's not an original realm with us. We were just reading how sociologists looked at it. It was very difficult for us to see that what the sociologists were thinking and interpret that in our terms and see what economists were doing that was different from the sociologists. Now, what is identity? So identity is who people think they are. Now, there's a more modern way to look at this. When you use that term, the public has a very different understanding of that from a sociologist. For sociologists, what identity means is how the person is thinking about themselves and how they're thinking about other people, that's other people's identities, within exactly the context in which the people are making their current decisions. Okay? So what does that mean? So in terms of, in more prosaic terms, it says we sit around and the way we think and what determines our decisions are the stories that we tell ourselves, the stories that we tell ourselves when we make those decisions. So now I think my more modern view of this is identity is really a code word for the fact that people are telling themselves stories. And when you tell yourself a given story, that determines how you're going to think and what your decisions are going to be. That's where stories come in. Now, yet more modern view of this, which is that the stories that people tell, they arise within the networks that people have. And so within these networks, so there's a much fuller picture of that. The stories that we tell arise from the networks of people we associate with, and partly because of their views of how we should behave, and our views of how we think that they think we should behave. So it's a much more interesting economics where people's decisions are made based upon this view of the stories we're telling ourselves. But then the stories that we tell ourselves depend upon the stories that those other people think we ought to be telling themselves. It's really a lot of fun. So we've gotten into a stage where there's a much more fun view of what economics, much more fun and much more expansive and much more realistic view of what economics is all about. There's a large component of people's choices which actually make them worse off, even though they think they're going to be better off. That this is something that regards what people eat. So obesity, for example, 35% of the US population is obese. And then there's all kinds of problems with medicine. These problems go through a significant amount of our whole gross national product. Now, think about one example. I think one of the worst examples of this is tobacco. So how did the government deal with tobacco? I feel that the government dealt extremely well with tobacco. So you go back to the 1950s. So in 1950, two seminal papers were published which showed statistically that lung cancer was associated with smoking. The one paper published in Britain and the other in the United States. And then a few years later, there was it was established scientifically that this was the case. They painted mice with tobacco tars, and the mice who were painted developed cancers, and the mice who were the control group, of course, they didn't develop any cancers at all. Now, the cigarette companies, they were threatened by this, of course. And so what they did is they had a very clever strategy. So what was their clever strategy? They would employ some scientists who they knew had doubts about whether cigarette smoking tobacco caused cancer. These tended to be scientists who thought that it was genetic. Well, there could have been some reason to think that, but in fact, we know they're wrong. So what did the government do? The government had a wonderful policy. So the Surgeon General of the United States, what he did was he set up a committee. And he set up the advisory committee to the Surgeon General of the United States on the issue of smoking and health. And they turned out this 500-page report. That 500-page report can be summarized in 3 words. Smoking is stupid. So the thing is, what the government did here is it didn't interfere with anybody's liberties very much, maybe not at all, but it created this new story. And thereafter, the tobacco industry in the United States had to deal with this story. So it played two roles. It played two subsequent roles that were very important. So first of all, a very clever young lawyer decided he would sue the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, for equal time to present against the tobacco companies to argue that, in fact, tobacco was a problem. And these people put on such terrible, grisly ads that, in fact, within a very short order, what the tobacco companies did is they ran for cover. So how did they ran for cover? They did not oppose a congressional bill which put a ban on TV and radio advertising of cigarettes and tobacco. So that was one way in which this story continued itself. Then you fast forward a few years, and this is actually quite remarkable. So what happened a few years later was people go to Arizona. Arizona is one of the driest states in the United States because it's desert country. And so a lot of the people who go to Arizona, a lot of the retirees, they have lung problems. And so it turns out, now the cigarette companies at this time, what they were claiming is that cigarette smoking is a choice. And you see, if they claimed it was a choice, then they wanted to get away from legal liability. And so if it's your choice, that's your problem, not their problem. Okay, so what the people in Arizona did, the anti-tobacco company did, they used this story about smoking is stupid. They used it to get the Arizona legislature to pass a law against indoor smoking. Okay, so the story that smoking is stupid, which was buttressed by the Surgeon General's report, was now playing a role again in Arizona. And so then we get the next stage of the story. So indoor smoking was then banned in Arizona, and then it caught on in other states. But now, the wonderful thing about this is, I feel this is a major role, is take a look at any major city, or maybe not even major cities. What you see is you go past office buildings, and what you see outside is you see these few people who are smoking their cigarettes. And what you do is, if you're a non-smoker, what you do is you pass them by and you give them a slight stare. Okay, you think, and the stare is, it follows the Surgeon General's report. You're thinking, smoking is stupid. And I don't know whether you have the same notion to that. The question is, it passes through your mind. Now, should I tell them that, or should I not? And you never stop and tell them that. You're too polite to do that. But they know what you're thinking. They look at you and they avoid your glance. But that passes on the notion that smoking is stupid. And you know what? I think the people who tend to do that outside smoking, I think they tend to quit. So this is how stories get passed. And this is an example, I think, a supreme example of how good government policy didn't interfere with people's liberties at all. And smoking seems to have gone down since the Surgeon General's report in the United States by the fraction of adults smoking by something like 0.5% per year. And that continues. So it's still something like 16%, which is higher than it should be, but at least in some senses it's a victory. I feel relative to the time that my ideas have just about the same amount of radical content. So when I first wrote my paper on asymmetric information, that was considered so radical that it was simply not to be considered. So I remember I sent it first to the American Economic Review. The editor of the American Economic Review disliked it so much that he did not send me referees' reports on it, and he just simply sent back, "I don't want this paper. This paper is too trivial." So that this was really considered quite radical at the time. So I think I'm actually more or less at the same spot now that I was then. What I think is what I'm looking at is sort of the frontier of where economics is going to be moving. It was like the rock and roll that in the 1960s the parents were tremendously disapproving of things like the Beatles and rock and roll, and it became the golden oldies. And now, actually, surprising, a little bit so to my surprise, identity economics is now becoming a thing which is beginning to be somewhat tolerated. And now I think it's actually moving in, I think, with some really good innovations that you're going to hear about from other people. I think it's now moving into a really interesting area where people can model it much more fully. And I feel it's going to change the scope and the range of economics much more generally. So I think we should be hopeful.